Hey, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be doing an introduction to Hegel's philosophy of history. So Hegel's philosophy of history is one of his last lecture series, and it's sort of the culmination of his work. If we want to, reference an earlier work, we could say that the philosophy of history is sort of a further build on of phenomenology of spirit, whereby spirit goes through its shapes of consciousness to eventually reach, self-relating consciousness in the form of mutual recognition, where I recognize myself as not just an I, but always compelled by the we, meaning that Hegel, destroys the difference between individual and society, and he sort of sees the society as always influencing the individual. So that's just a basic explanation of his early work, Phenomenology of Spirit. And so, where does this take us? Well, Hegel gives us this sort of entire breakdown of history. Now, we begin in the Asiatic region, in the Asiatic regions, right? China and India. So we begin with China, ancient China, and we've known this for a long time in history, is that China is the oldest society in the world, right? The oldest country. And so what Hegel starts with is that, okay, so following from his phenomenology of spirit, spirit is always in the sense of is always in this abstractness at first, right? In its immediacy before it has undergone struggle and historical development. It appears in this undifferentiatedness. So what Hegel says is that this is exactly what China is. Ancient China was a society sort of overrun by this idea of substantial freedom, where freedom is wholly in the power of the emperor. Freedom is not delineated to other people in the society, right? And it is only through this passing into China to India, where India has this caste system. And like China, right, India and China both have this sort of what Hegel says is the Eastern idea that nature is always above spirit. What this means is that just like in China, where this Tao, this sort of undifferentiated absolute being, even Buddhism, right, the drive towards abstract nothingness. This is what motivates these spirits, right? These shapes of consciousness. Same thing in India, right? You have the caste system. The caste system is regarded as the natural order, right, of society, and it is not. In this caste system, of course, right, prevents freedom. And if you know Hegel, you know that his whole thing is about freedom. So he doesn't like the caste system, of course. So China and India are both dominated by this sort of lack of freedom, but this is beyond just a basic historical understanding where historian would go, okay, well, there's an emperor and they had totalitarian rule and extra. Hegel's whole point is that this idea of totalitarian rule extended not just into their political sphere, which is what a simple historian would do, but that it extended into their theological understanding, right? Again, we said that both China and India and Eastern religions in general evaluate the natural to be above the spiritual. The spiritual meaning the human. As Hegel's whole thing is that the human is that which should be the focus of religion, right? So we're moving on from that. We go from China to India. Now Hegel goes into he just kind of jumps a bit and goes to Persia. Persian spirit is sort of overrun by this idea of abstract abstract goodness, and Hegel says this is exemplified in the metaphor of light. Persian religions, he says, have this notion that light is this sort of is the divine, but Hegel says that this is far too abstract, right? We haven't thought divine in concrete terms. We're just simply we're still thinking without concreteness. So what we must do to get out of this is that we must look at where at this period of war and this Persian spirit, which doesn't have self-consciousness with itself yet. So we kind of go past that. He doesn't spend much time on Persia. But now we're moving into the Roman world. So Hegel sees the Roman world in one sentence as the birthplace of Christianity, right? That's what he sees the Roman world as summarized. And he sees this because he's like, okay, so the Roman world was dominated by this idea of the complete war and vengeance and all this. And they also didn't have the same level of regard for beauty and divinity as the Greeks, but that they just copied, right? They just imitated the Greeks and took, their ideas of the gods. The Roman idea of Jupiter is, simply a reformulation of the Greek gods. So Hegel's like, yeah, this is just not good. But this struggle in Rome produced what Hegel sees as, of course, the ultimate revelation of spirit revealing itself in Christianity. So the struggle in Rome, this struggle both in the idea of inwardness, meaning people's ability to think, people are beginning to think more and think about, well, this sort of Roman Greek mythology doesn't really make sense to us, so they're thinking beyond this, and this is where a lot of religious philosophies come up, and Hegel says, like Stoicism and Epicureanism and all these kinds, and these are very popular in Rome because people are starting to think more. They're not just accepting the dogma of Greco-Roman mythology. And Rome is also plagued by corruption in the state. Of course, he mentions Caesar, and he classifies Caesar as what's known as a great historical individual, a world historical individual, meaning that they are someone who has overcome their circumstances and pushed against the spirit of their times to try and accomplish something new. This, for Hegel, is a major sticking point. The idea of a world historical individual is someone that pushes against the spirit of their times and pushes towards something new. He gives Caesar as an example for Rome. But with Caesar dead, he talks about a couple of more wars that Rome had, and eventually we get to the point where he mentions Jesus. Jesus comes onto the scene, but he preempts this with an explanation of the story of the fall in the Bible, right? And he recalls this as a mythical explanation, which is interesting for a Christian to regard the story of Adam and Eve as mythical. But it's important to recognize that Hegel, quite like a lot of classic theologians, did not see the Bible as purely factual. He saw it as a metaphor for that which is true and in for itself. Meaning that Jesus, he gives us in a passage that, okay, cool, you can talk about the exegesis, you can talk about the critical history, you can talk about this, that, and of Jesus, but the point is that this metaphor of Jesus gives us this idea of a truth in and for itself. Thereby we should acknowledge it as true, right? Hegel doesn't even play this game where he's like, oh no, Jesus is 100% like this guy that lived and died on the cross and all this. He's like, the historical record is, murky. We know there was a guy named Jesus, but we don't really know what he did. Right? We have these stories, but these stories give us this inner idea, and this is where it gets kind of mystical. This is where you see a mystical element of Hegel's philosophy, where he says this idea of Jesus, this concretized spirit in the form of man, gives us this revelation to the inner truth of the world, to the universe. So, again, it's very mystical what Hegel gets onto here, but that's simply kind of what he wants to get to, is that Jesus and the religion of Christianity may not be entirely accurate, truthful, historical, whatever you want to say, but it gives us this inkling into the truth of the universe, and it is the realized revelation of spirit realizing itself. Now, how does spirit realize itself? Well, if you recognized Hegel's philosophy of logic, or what we would call metaphysics, you would know that spirit can only recognize itself if it goes through a period of otherness. Now, what is this period of otherness? Well, this is the Son that, we've talked about Jesus, and this is where this comes in, is that we have God the Father, but then we have to go through a period of otherness. Then this is Jesus. Now, Jesus is the Spirit, which is sort of, when he's on earth following the story, he's not fully actualized as spirit. It is only after his death where spirit comes to the forefront. When Jesus goes up to heaven, Hegel says that then Jesus and God are both spirit, right? The diversity of God and the diversity of God the Father and Jesus the Son is unified in the form of spirit. and this is Hegel's whole point in his part of the philosophy about the Roman world, is that these historical, or in Marxian terms, material conditions give us the forefront, give us the bedding, give us the ground for Christianity to appear. Christianity did not appear in the Greek world because Greeks did not have these historical material conditions, right? The Greeks fully thought of the spirit in this sense of spirit was enveloped by the natural world. A simple analogy would be a statue, right? The statue is made out of stone, but and that is the natural, stones in nature. But what a statue exemplifies tends to be the form of man, right? The spirit. Thereby, spirit is encased in the natural form. It has not fully exemplified itself. It has not emancipated itself from the natural form in the Greek, which is why Christianity cannot appear in the Greek society. Now, it's important to recognize this because this is why Hegel is extremely materialist with his historical understanding. Unlike what Marx says, who has a pretty bad reading of Hegel in most terms, I think, is that Hegel is not saying that, oh, people just make ideas and the world just functions off ideas. That's entirely incorrect. Hegel's point is that things have to happen in the world for spirit to realize itself. And spirit is simply realizing itself towards the absolute idea. The absolute idea being freedom, right? Or the mutual recognition where I already went through that, right? Freedom is the mutual recognition where I recognize myself as a we and not just an I. So this is fundamental because we're not just dealing with this idea that, oh, people just make ideas and those ideas make history. This is just a terrible Marxian reading. Hegel's point is that material conditions directly influence the moving of the world and the moving of history. Spirit is only insofar as those material conditions actualize themselves. In other words, we can draw on Aristotle, who Hegel mentions, that things that exist in a universal, right, in an abstract universal, they aren't really there, right? When we think of an animal, the term animal, we don't encounter the animal in the world. We encounter a dog, we encounter a cat, we encounter, something like that. We encounter a dog, a singular, a particular. But the universal, the abstract universal of animal stands as that explanatory condition for what we encounter, right? Again, it is first an explanation, as Aristotle would say, kind of like spirit, for Hegel's term, right? Spirit, the shapes of consciousness, they stand in abstract universal to the world that occurs. So the world that occurs in tandem with spirit, but spirit does not stand as this thing which pushes the world as this like Platonic emanation of will. That's entirely an incorrect reading and very Marxian, and Marx, again, terrible reading of Hegel. So it's just important to recognize that throughout Hegel's philosophy of history, we aren't discussing this sort of abstract will that pushes people. People push themselves. But when people push themselves, there's this function that's happening in society. And this can be simply understood in just a basic example of when a fire burns a house down. The fire doesn't just burn the house down. A fire burns down other houses. The fire spreads. This, I think, is an analogy for what spirit is. Spirit is this movement of ideas, of peoples that expand just beyond one particular event. The French Revolution, the spirit of whatever you want to say, the French people or whatever. It didn't just influence the French Revolution. The French Revolution didn't just happen, and everything that happened afterwards was in a vacuum from that, right? The French Revolution intimately continued the movement of spirit, right? It continued its own movement in other forms. And this is important for Hegel's philosophy of history. Now, one final thing I will say is that we've gone to this point, right? That Christianity has revealed itself as the revelation of spirit. Now, how does spirit become concrete? Well, we already said Jesus, right? But there's this other function that's very important. Because if you know Hegel's metaphysics, you know that God and man are an ontological inseparable, meaning that you cannot think God, nor can you think man in abstract and one-sidedness. You must think God and man as together. And Hegel says that worship worshiping the divine is precisely the manner that you do this. When you worship the divine, you retroactively realize that the God and man himself. Thereby, you worship your own self, and you worship God at once, because you worship yourself, you worship the innerness of God, and that makes you worship the divine itself too. It kind of works like in tandem, you can say. So yeah, that's the final sort of understanding of spirit, and this is why Hegel says this is why we can understand the spirit, the Christian religion to still be so powerful today, is that it takes this idea of spirit as not just an abstract, not just a light, a Persian light, not just as a Chinese Tao, not just as an Indian Dharma or whatever, or Hindu Vishnu, or or a Jewish Yahweh. It takes this idea of spirit to always be self-relating, towards man and to God. And this is the true revealed truth of the Christian religion. And it is further the revelation of history itself. So yeah, that's Hegel's philosophy of history. I left out a lot of the parts about the Germanic Empire because it's just sort of recapitulating what I've already said. The whole point is that once we get to Christianity, that's sort of like the break of history. Hegel even says that, right, Christian history fundamentally changes after the revelation of Christ. So yes, that's Hegel's philosophy of history, and I've responded to some parts of Marx that are terrible readings. I've tried and exemplified the material foundation to Hegel's philosophy of history, while also giving voice to the teleological components, right? But certainly that's it's kind of hard to do in a YouTube video. But if you would like to read more, of course, Hegel's lectures on philosophy of history are great. You can read, Phenomenology of Spirit to kind of get the basis, and then this is more of a concreteness where he describes actual historical events, actual historical people, and not just abstract metaphysical terms. But so yeah, that's going to be it for the video. Thank you for watching, and take care. Have a nice day. Like and subscribe.